The G20 is a very important forum for all of us. We know that this is affecting majority of the global economy, trade, as well as investment.
With the humble and hospitality of Indonesia, welcome. We achieved some promising progress through multilateralism, through G20.
At the end of 2021, we've paved the road to 2022's G20 presidency, promoting Recover Together, Recover Stronger as its main theme. The first Finance and Central Bank Deputies meeting in the Indonesian presidency has established 6 priority agendas in the finance track that will be discussed throughout 2022. Now, it's time to get the wheels turning. One of the most crucial agenda in the Indonesian presidency is exit strategy to support recovery. COVID-19 has led to a severe global recession. In response, countries have taken unprecedented fiscal and monetary policies to protect the economy. These policies, along with the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, has brought positive outcomes. Economic activities had begun to resume. Nevertheless, recovery doesn't come as a one-size-fits-all item. Advanced economies are recovering much faster than their emerging markets counterpart, while low-income countries are lagging. The different timings of exit policies can potentially bring negative spillover effect for countries. To mitigate these risks, a well-planned, well-calibrated, and well-communicated exit strategy is needed. Under Indonesia's presidency, the G20 countries and invitees will work together to create policy settings for a smooth exit strategy. Discussions will be held in the working group level as well as high-level meetings. For it is our duty to ensure that emerging from this pandemic, no one gets left behind. Recover together, recover stronger.
Hari ini ada rencana kemana? Kamu masih aktif kerja di luar ya? Masa pandemi gini memang banyak sektor yang terkena dampaknya. Cuma beberapa sektor strategis aja yang boleh beroperasi, tentu dengan berbagai syarat yang harus dipenuhi. Ada sih yang beruntung masih bisa kerja dari rumah, tapi banyak juga yang tetap harus keluar untuk cari uang, kayak kamu. Kalau gitu harus didukung dengan stamina yang kuat dan protokol kesehatan yang ketat. Kamu udah bawa masker cadangan kan? Hand sanitizer juga jangan lupa. Jaga kebersihan dan rajin cuci tangan ya. Aku gak akan bosan ngingetin kamu soal ini. Jauhi kerumunan dan hindari kontak fisik dengan orang lain. Kalau ada keperluan transaksi sehari-hari, mending pakai cara pembayaran non-tunai aja. Kan udah banyak tempat yang nyediain cara pembayaran pakai kris. Tinggal scan kode krisnya pakai aplikasi pembayaran di handphone. Lebih aman kan bayar tanpa bersentuhan? Aku sadar, meski sama-sama menghadapi pandemi, kita punya perjuangan yang berbeda-beda. Tapi dalam menghadapi virus ini, kita harus saling jaga. Jaga diri biar nggak ketularan, dan jaga jarak biar nggak menularkan sekitar. Yuk, pakai masker 2 lapis. Semangat kerjanya!
The G20 is a very important forum for all of us.
Once again, we would like to invite those who are still outside to come inside as the seminar is about to start. Please take your seats. Your Excellencies, especially Your Excellency Governor of Bank Indonesia, Bapak Peri Warjio, thank you for coming, Bapak. Heads of delegations, distinguished speakers, distinguished guests, participants, observers, organizing committee, ladies and gentlemen. Very good afternoon to all of you from here, Jakarta, Indonesia. Welcome to Jakarta, Indonesia. Welcome to Jakarta Convention Center, one of the iconic venues in Jakarta. And welcome to the high-level seminar on strengthening global health architecture. I need a big round of applause from you. It is an honor for me, Faisal Ahda, to be the master of ceremony of our today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, as we know together, this high-level seminar is one of the side events of the second Finance and Central Bank Deputies meeting and the first Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting. It is co-organized by the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia and the Central Bank of Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic situation, and also in the context of summarizing and sharing lessons learned from such a challenging situation in several countries, as mentioned earlier, this high-level seminar will discuss strengthening global health architecture. A number of issues will be discussed, and we are going to have two separate sessions for today's seminar. The first session will touch the issues of strengthening the global health system, and the second session will cover the topic of mobilizing financing for global public goods. Each session will be attended by different panelists, so it is a very valuable opportunity for us to listen to different views from different perspectives. In addition to the panelists and the participants who are physically present here, we also have some panelists and participants who are virtually connected to us through WebEx. Ladies and gentlemen, before moving forward to the first session of the seminar, it is an honor for me to invite Her Excellency, the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, to come to the stage to deliver her opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Mulyani Indrawati.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellencies, finance ministers, as well as our colleagues, central bank governors, speakers, as well as moderators, G20 delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to welcome you all here in Jakarta, whether you are attending physically as well as virtually, to this high-level seminar on strengthening global health architecture. Today, we will have the opportunity to discuss the two focus areas of the seminar. The first one, we will review the opportunity, we will review and evaluate the possible ways to strengthen health system at national level, regional, as well as global levels, and also to make the world better prepared and more resilient to all public health threats. The second issue that we are going to discuss, we will brainstorm on possible financing modality and identify a way forward that promises the most added value for both contributors as well as recipients. These two focus areas are key to our collective effort to strengthen the global health architecture. Indonesia G20 presidency comes at a critical juncture in the unpredictable path of the COVID-19 pandemic. The twists and turns of the last 2 years have made it clear that the pandemic is not over until it's over for all. And even as the world continues to tackle COVID-19, a stark reality has set in. This will not be the last pandemic. The theme of Recover Together, Recover Stronger under Indonesia G20 presidency underline the importance of global cooperation to overcome the current pandemic and prepare for the future ones. Given that the capacity to tackle health threat it varies across countries. Indonesia G20 presidency will also focus on three main pillars. The first one that we are going to discuss in this seminar is global health architecture. The second one, sustainable energy transition. And the third one, digital transition. Indonesia invites all countries to strengthen the global health architecture in order to build a world that is more resilient to pandemic as well as to future shocks. The G20 should be at the forefront of this process. Strengthening global health architecture will surely be challenging. A strong commitment and greater investment than ever before are needed. This is to limit how we are going to address the pandemic consequences and how we are going to be able to mitigate their impact with essential health resource mobilization. Failure to realize this commitment will result in the heavy social and economic costs that we are all has witnessing in the past 2 years. So strengthening the global health architecture during Indonesia G20 presidency will not only important, it is necessary for all of us. We are going to cover 3 priority issues in this theme. First, how we could build global health system resilience that will require essential health and financial resources mobilization for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, or we call it the PPR. In addition to enhancement of the global health surveillance system. Second one, harmonizing global health protocol standard. This is important because people want to continue mobility across the world, but we also do understand that it can also create risk. This harmonization global health protocol standard will include harmonizing of global health guidelines, as well as health information system connectivity among different countries for international travel. The third one, expanding global manufacturing and knowledge hub for pandemic PPR. This will comprise expansion of global manufacturing hubs for vaccine, therapeutic, and diagnostic to developing countries, as well as sharing of knowledge for PPR in health crisis. As mandated by the G20 leaders, financing for pandemic PPR has to be adequate, sustainable, and better coordinated. This, in turn, require continuous cooperation between global health actors and finance decision makers to address mobilizing of essential medical countermeasures, including the discovery, development, and delivery of new health tools, and also to address the financing gaps through mobilizing an appropriate mix of existing and new financing mechanism. Ladies and gentlemen, there have been many calls for expanded investment in pandemic PPR in the wake of SARS and also Ebola. Prior reports have also highlighted the critical role of domestic financing given the significant recurrent cost of preparedness. The key messages are that the members need first to incentivize domestic financing by including preparedness in macro as well as fiscal monitoring. The second one, collectively commit to increase international financing for pandemic PPR. And the third one, to develop a robust system for tracking and reporting of government spending on preparedness. We are all aware, for instance, that the G20 high-level independent panel has identified 4 major gaps in pandemic PPR. The first one, globally networked surveillance and research to prevent and detect emerging infectious diseases. The second one, resilient national system to strengthen a critical foundation for global pandemic preparedness and response. The third one, supply of medical countermeasure and tools to shorten the response time to a pandemic and deliver equitable global access. And the last one, good governance to ensure the system is tightly coordinated, properly funded, and with clear accountability for outcome. For international financing of pandemic PPR to add value and address financing gaps, it needs to strengthen pandemic preparedness at the country level and also at the regional level. Investment must be made in surveillance and detection, public health laboratories, institutional capacity strengthening, human resources, health system strengthening, and other priority areas. Another added value can be provided through the resource for research and development, supply capacity, and also access to medical countermeasure. The frequency and impact of pandemic-prone pathogens are increasing. While modest investment in PPR capacity can prevent and also contain outbreak, thereby drastically reduce the cost of response and also the broader economic as well as social impact of a large-scale outbreak. Ultimately, if we are all going to be succeed, investment will also help address the many slow burn challenges that are driver of mortality today, such as HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and antimicrobial resistance. So, ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 has highlighted the escalating risk that pandemic health threat pose to long-term economic stability, growth, and social cohesion. Effective coordination between finance and health officials definitely can enhance the timeliness and effectiveness of responses to the health and economic challenges, which is created by this pandemic COVID-19 and also by other subsequent pandemic. And that's why the G20 Joint Finance and Health Task Force, as mandated by our leaders, is a step forward in developing coordination arrangement between finance and health ministers. This task force provides a platform to explore how to best coordinate our response to future pandemic. The G20 should be at the vanguard of this effort by articulating and presenting options for enhanced coordination and cooperation between finance and health ministers. It is not contesting or competing with the other existing institution. Adequate financing for pandemic PPR is one of the current gaps in the global health architecture. So the task force is expected to discuss the modalities to establish a G20 driven financial facility to be designed inclusively and with the central coordination role of the WHO. It will engage from the outside with low and middle income countries and also non G20 partners and multilateral development banks to ensure adequate and sustained financing for pandemic PPR. With the support of international organizations, this task force is conducting a gap analysis of existing international financial mechanism for pandemic PPR. The COVID-19 crisis further revealed that the magnitude of financing and the capacity to coordinate funds to fill critical gaps are currently still inadequate. It is clear that funding should be prioritized for those countries with the greatest need and should also reinforce countries' effort to strengthen their own health system. In addition to augmenting resources for existing institutions to support PPR priority, it is critical to have a dedicated stream of additional international financing for PPR that can be channeled flexibly through existing institutions to strengthen further PPR in a way that brings the most added value for both the contributors as well as the recipient. However, we recognize in identifying this financing gap and modality, it is not a simple process. Trust building and cooperation is really critical. And today, it is really difficult to build trust and confidence. Within the Indonesia G20 presidency, we do hope that we are going to be able to provide you with the platform for all of us together to build trust and confidence. Because trust and confidence is actually coming from two sides. It cannot be imposed. It cannot be, in this case, dictated. So I look forward to our discussion today. This is also a forum for all of us to discuss and to be open-minded. What is actually the challenge that we are all country, all humanity are facing, and our responsibility to be able to address and learn from this devastated 2 years pandemic. I would like, in this case, express my appreciation for all G20 participants as well as delegates, because I'm sure the G20 can take a leading role in strengthening the global health system, as well as mobilizing health financing as an important global public goods. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from all excellencies, finance ministers, as well as central bank governors, speakers, as well as moderators. Your view is definitely will shape our collective action to tackle health threats across country globally. This is not going to be the one and the only one. The world and we are all need to be ready for the next challenge. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a very productive seminar. Thank you.
Thank you to Her Excellency Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, for your welcoming remarks. It's such an appreciation for us to have you here together with us, Ibu. As mentioned by Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, that our today's topic is one of the three main pillars that has become the focus of the G20 Indonesia's presidency. And we also can have a note from Ibu Sri Mulyani's remarks that a number of issues should be discussed today. Among of them are about how to create global health system resilience and global health protocol standard. And we also can take a note that how important domestic financing supported by relevant international collaboration in creating a resilient global health architecture. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our time to enter the first session of the seminar, in which we will discuss strengthening the global health system. The session will be facilitated by a moderator. In this opportunity, we are happy to have a senior anchor of CNN Indonesia, Desi Anwar, to manage the discussion flow. Ladies and gentlemen, let me invite to the stage Desi Anwar. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Minister Bu Ani, and also Minister Pak Budi. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, near and far, wherever you are, whether virtually or present here with us today in the Jakarta Convention Center. Welcome to the high-level seminar of Strengthening the Global Architecture. It's my great pleasure to be the moderator for this first session. And I think you all agree after listening to Minister Srimulyani's introductory speech, this is an important time to discuss on how we can improve the global health system. We are currently in a pandemic that has lasted now and gone into its second year. We don't know when it will end, but for sure there will be more pandemics in the future. So I think this topic is not only extremely important, because in the last couple of years, what has this pandemic shown us? It has shown us the fragility of the health system, not just on the national level here in Indonesia, but across the regions and all over the world. We've seen how many lives have been lost. We've seen how many jobs have been lost, incomes disappeared, the economy facing its enormous challenges, children losing opportunity, and of course the scramble for PPE, for masks, for everything to do with health. And I think not only that, but on the global scale, we've seen our increasing dependence on health providers, on health carers. We've seen our increasing dependence on science-based information to tell us more about what the virus is all about. And we've seen also the gaps across the world where some countries fare better than others in coping and tackling and dealing with the pandemic. We've seen the race for drugs, medicines, vaccinations. And I think the G20, comprising of the world's most populous and largest economies, is very much well placed to be in the driver's seat to make sure that in the future, we can create a much more resilient global health architecture. And I think this is something that we all look forward to. Pandemics, more pandemics will come, but what we have to do is to see how we as a global, as humans on this planet can work together to face and tackle the pandemic together. So without much further ado, I would like to start this discussion on strengthening the global health system. The discussion will feature esteemed ministers from all over the world, and we will focus on ways and options available in order to perhaps make our global health system much more resilient, capable of solving problems, and also how to close those gaps that we've seen in the world. I would now like to introduce our panelists. And first of all, this is G20. Indonesia has a presidency, so I would like to join me on the stage. Our health minister, Minister Budi Gunadi Sadikin, would you like to come on the stage to join us? Big welcome, please, to Minister Budi. Thank you, Pat. Minister Budi was appointed as Minister of Health back in December 2020 when Indonesia was still at its peak of the pandemic. And it's been very busy now with trying to vaccinate everybody in Indonesia and dealing with our current Omicron third wave here in Indonesia. And joining us online, virtually, and we certainly miss you. One of the things that this pandemic has seen is our growing reliance on technology. So via online, I would like to welcome our next speaker, the Minister of Health from Italy, His Excellency Roberto Speranza. Minister Speranza is in his second term as Minister of Health and started in February 2021. Minister Speranza?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hi, everybody.
Do we have you online?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, Minister Speranza. Buongiorno, can you hear me?
Buongiorno, I can hear you perfectly. Do you
Okay,
hear me?
thank you. Welcome to the seminar, and we miss you here in Jakarta. Our next speaker, of course, is someone who is very familiar. He is the person we all look for guidance during the pandemic. Is the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. Dr. Tedros, how are you?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, and it's good to have you, whether it's
Thank you.
virtually.
Terima
And
kasih.
terima kasih sama-sama. Last but not least, we have Excellency Minister of International Development of Norway, Anna Beata Tvenerheim. Minister Tvenerheim, I hope I'm pronouncing your name
Excellent.
right, correctly.
Pronunciation. Good morning from Norway.
Good morning indeed. And again, it's good to have us, all in the same room, whether virtually or in person. Minister Svinnerheim is also responsible for development cooperation under the UN system. So without further ado, for the next hour and so, I would like us to start our discussion on strengthening the global health system. And let me give the floor to you first, Minister Budi, because Indonesia is now the presidency of G20. And of course, um, we are still, like I said, in the middle of a pandemic, and we don't know whether there is light at the end of the tunnel. But what is important, that this is an opportunity to actually address a very important building a global health system. Perhaps your thoughts, Minister. What would be the priorities and the ideal concrete outcomes that you would like to see in this G20 meeting this year?
Thank you, Daisy, and my friends Roberto and Dr. Tedros, and also Anna. Ladies and gentlemen, following the two world wars, humanity has raised higher beyond disparities and conflict to build a peaceful and prosperous, healthier world. If you remember, the world leaders gathered in 1944 in Bretton Woods. They established two institutions with the spirit of solidarity and cooperation. These two institutions was the World Bank and the IMF. So these two institutions play a major role and a major pillar as to support the global finance architecture and to turn a devastated world into a modern civilizations that we live now. These two global institutions are also a global financial institution as a part of a global finance architecture that saved the world during several global economic crises that we have seen in 1998 and 2008. Today, humanity faces another type of war. We face another type of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused life of more than 5.9 million people and got 400 million people to get ill. Now the world's citizens are looking back again to the world leaders. When are you going to start building a stronger global health architecture that will prepare and protect our future generations? Ladies and gentlemen, as Ibu Sri Mulyani mentioned, the pandemics and major health emergency will occur, and no single government and institution will be able to address this alone. We have to address this together. We cannot do this exclusively. We need to solve this issue inclusively. And our collective response today will define the trajectory of the current and future pandemics. As Indonesia assumed the G20 presidency, President Jokowi proposed initiative in three major areas. The first one is a global health architecture. Second one is a digital economy. And the third one is on energy transitions. As the Indonesian health ministers, I would like to deliberate Indonesia's commitment to these three priorities in strengthening the global health architectures. So the first priority, we need to establish a better global health system resilience. And we have three things that we would like to achieve on these first priorities. The first one, we would like to establish a global fund. And this is a continuation of my friends, Roberto, during a G20 presidency in Italy. Why we need this fund? Because we need enough power and speed when the next pandemic comes. If IMF can come and help any country that have monetary problem everywhere in the world in terms of weeks, we should have the capacity also, the funding capacity and the speed to make decision and disperse money for health crisis everywhere in the world. And we have learned in a difficult way how to do it at the beginning of this pandemic. And we realized that we need to using the existing institution and infrastructure. Although in health sector, the financial part is quite fragmented and sometimes it's make it difficult to gather enough size and also to execute promptly, which is what we need to establish. The second thing that we need to achieve in the first priorities, money is not enough. Indonesia have money during crisis. We cannot access masks. We cannot access ventilators. We cannot access vaccines. So we need to be able to transfer this fund money into access to emergency health countermeasure. WHO has initiated a group called Accelerator, where Gavi is there, SEPI was there, UNICEF is also there. These temporary cooperations help countries in the world to determine what are their demand, the requirements of vaccine, therapeutics, and diagnostic tools, and looking for alternative how to access them. We need to formalize this in the future. We need to strengthen this type of cooperation in the future. Because again, in health crisis, money is not enough. We need to translate the money with the existing global health institutions to make sure we can translate that into access to emergency health countermeasure. The third things that we need to achieve in the first agenda, in the first priorities, is we realize that when the virus hit us in Wuhan, in terms of weeks, the genome sequence data was uploaded and it is accessed by researcher in United States called Moderna and also accessed from the researcher in Germany from BioNTech. And this speed is needed in a pandemic because the virus spread very, very fast. So it is our key objectives also. We need to formalize this global genome sequence data sharing platform. Forget about geopolitics, but remember about humanity. Forget about economics of who get the data, but remember how many lives you can save when you can do it quickly and the scientists trust these entities to submit their data. The second priorities that Indonesia presidency would like also to propose is we need to harmonize the global health protocol standard. You go to one country, they need a set of rules for PCR tests, vaccine, also quarantine. You go a different country, they have a different rules. Can we do something like immigration processes, where every country that you come, you have a single document called passport, and you have a in the immigration that is smooth and similar across country. I believe we have to do the same thing, utilizing technology. Indonesia has started to work with Saudi Arabia. I'm also the chairman of the ASEAN Health Ministers. We start to do it using technology. And hopefully, we can also work with the European Union using WHO issued standard protocols. And I do hope that we can do this globally. The third and the last priority issues that Indonesia presidency would like to propose in this health system architecture is we need to redistribute the global manufacturing hub and the global research hub. If the pandemic hit a country badly, like you watch in the movie War Z, and sometimes that country can collapse. The manufacturing capacity, production capacity is gone, including the scientists that turns into zombies. So if we have, another global manufacturing hub, especially in the southern region, whether in Africa, in Asia, in America, if something happened, then we have another centers for manufacturing and also research. And Indonesia is very committed to establish this global manufacturing hub and research hub, especially on the southern regions. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my first year as the Minister of Health and 30 years as a banker. I've seen more global economic crises that started in finance than this only one global crisis that started in health. And I can tell you, back in 1998 as a junior banker, when I had my first crisis, huge crisis in Indonesia, that took our GDP 5 years to recover, I remember I met an international banker, and he told me, Budi, you have nothing right on your left side of your balance sheet, and you have nothing left on your right side of your balance sheet. It took me, 30 seconds to understand what he said. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have a crisis that, started in the health sector rather than financial sectors. But we can learn during crisis, there is an reform. The biggest reform in Indonesian political system happened in 1998 during crisis. The biggest banking sector and financial reform for Indonesia happened during 1998 crisis. Otherwise, the central bank will be still under the government. And a saying that only through great earthquakes, lofty mountain rises. So crisis gave us opportunity. So this is the opportunity for me as the health minister. Thanks a lot for the financial community. We have this joint health and finance minister task force that hopefully we can rebuild a much stronger global health architecture. And I need your help. As the saying said, if you want to go fast, you can go alone. But if you want to go far, then you need to go together. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Budi. We have a lot of food for thoughts there. A crisis, of course, also creates opportunities. And I think this is a good time and a good opportunity for all of us globally to reset things, to improve on how we do things, and to learn from past lessons and do things better. And Minister Budi wants the concrete deliverables from this G20 presidency. Some of them are things like funding, adequate funding, of course, access to essential health resources, data sharing platforms, and of course harmonizing global protocols. This is also very, very important because we are a connected world, we are a globalized world. And of course, global manufacturing hubs is very important in order to ensure that every country gets adequate access to all the necessary equipment. Now, I'd like to turn to you now, Mr. Speranza, as we know Italy was last year's G20 presidency, and the leaders gathered together and pledged to actually do something about creating and strengthening the global health architecture. Now, Minister Speranza, after you've listened to Minister Budi's wish list for what Indonesia would like things to, be the result of this G20 meeting. What are your thoughts, and what do you think should be the priorities for G20 countries when it comes to creating and strengthening, building a global health architecture?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to say good luck to my friend Budi and to the Indonesian presidency. And you know that you have the full friendship and the full support of Italy and I think of the countries of the world. We are still inside the pandemic. In these days, different countries of the world are in different stages of confronting the new variant, the Omicron variant. While the evolution of the infection curve in some of our countries indicates that vaccines and distancing measures have contained this new variant, we are still far from definitely defeating COVID-19. The most important challenge remains to vaccinate 70% of the global population in the middle of this year in order to prevent the emerging new variants. We are increasingly aware that only together can we all get out of this crisis. If we are today discussing how to strengthen the global health architecture, it is because we have taken already a path. In the Declaration of Roma in September, during the G20 health ministers assessed the devastating consequences of the pandemic on global economies and societies, including reversed progress on meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. COVID has witnessed differences between and within nations, disproportionately affecting vulnerable peoples, groups, and areas. Therefore, we reaffirmed altogether our commitment to achieving the health-related SDGs target, and in particular to advancing health for all through universal health coverage, a goal that we should always keep in mind. Secondly, we indicated the need to develop common global strategies to support research, development, and the equitable distribution of countermeasures, especially vaccines, and to shorten their production cycle. We recognize the extensive COVID-19 immunizations as a global public good, and our commitment to all collaborative effort in this respect, including the diversification of vaccine manufacturing capacity, technology transfers, and the protection of supply chains. There is no doubt that we need to reinforce the global health architectures and governance in order to better address current and future challenges and strengthen health systems and partnerships for global health emergencies, preparedness and response capacities. An important reflections on the global health architectures with the WHO at its center was also conducted. Two important working the decision to negotiate a new international instrument to increase global preparedness to health emergencies based on the concepts of transparency and accountability and the revision of international health regulations. The work of the independent panels, which met in 2021, made us aware that national health systems and the global health system had been affected by years, perhaps decades, of underinvestments. At the same time, it was recognized that the cost of COVID-19 and of the future pandemics are far greater than those needed to refinance global public health for the future pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. It is possible that we are going to face new pandemics. The G20 high-level panel warned that COVID-19 is neither the first nor the last health emergency we will face, predicting a pandemic or health emergencies at least once every 5 years. Therefore, as the panel added, the economic case for investments is compelling, reducing the risk of events whose cost to governments' budgets are 700 times the annual additional international investments. The Pan-European Commission of Health and Sustainable Development endorsed the importance of investing in health and health systems as a fundamental of societal cohesion and well-being, which in turn will support economic growth. Hence, the idea of a closer cooperation and coordination between the health and finance work streams and the creation of the Finance Health Task Force agreed by the leaders in the Rome Declaration G20. The task force, led by Indonesia and Italy, has already met twice and is reflecting on how to bridge the gap with respect to the funding needed to have an adequate level of PPR, including through exploring the modalities for the creation of a new financial facility and how to strengthen health and finance cooperation going forward. We are fully committed to these tasks, and I believe there is an excellent chance of success, especially if we can achieve a true and balanced integration of perspective between finance and health ministers. If we have the support of the international organizations active on global health issues, starting from the WHO, which must remain at the center of the global health architecture, we can now capitalize on the other key lesson of the pandemic, which is the importance of the One Health approach. As we set the medium-term goals, however, we still need to work on the short terms. The battle against COVID-19, as I mentioned at the beginning, has yet not been won, and in order to do so, we need the global vaccination campaign to undergo a major acceleration, while the effort to have a truly global production of vaccines and medicine countries, it is necessary to multiply the donation of doses, starting with those distributed by COVAX and Gavi, to which I would like to express all my thanks and encouragement. But we must also act on the distribution and demand side to increase the absorption capacity of vaccines around the world and overcome operational and logistical difficulties. The Finance Health Task Force will also monitor the global vaccination campaign and can certainly help accelerate this process through careful promotion and encouragement. I would like to conclude with some hope. We are not at the end of COVID, but we may be at the beginning of the end. As Pope Francis once famously said, the worst thing we can do with this crisis is to miss the opportunity to change that it was provided. The work we are doing collectively as G20 goes in the direction of meeting this expectation and is worth of all our efforts. Thank you, and I wish all you good work.
Mrs. Speranza, and stand by for more questions later on. And indeed, I don't think we should all, miss this opportunity to do things better, miss this opportunity to change and to act. And Minister Speranza mentioned some of the global targets that we have, including SDGs and the desire to have a universal health coverage, which is, of course, very, very important. And the idea of common global strategies and supporting research, as well as making sure that vaccination manufacturing is also diversified in order to create a much more equal and equitable vaccination process. And he also mentioned about strengthening the World Health Organization. Dr. Tedros, let me ask you to pick up on this, because the G20 has committed to invest or to focus on building this global health architecture. How do you see WHO's, what needs to be strengthened, and what should the G20 countries focus on after listening to both health ministers? And it's my own question, should the world have the same rules when it comes to dealing with pandemics, given that every country has different resources? And if so, how to monitor it? Dr. Tedros, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Desi. Your Excellency Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Your Excellency, my good friend Budi Gunadi, and Your Excellency, my good friend Roberto Speranza, Your Excellency Anbet Tibinarem, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. And I thank Indonesia for hosting this important discussion. Terima kasih. The fact that this discussion is being held during a meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors is very appropriate. It demonstrates Indonesia's understanding that strengthening global health security goes far beyond the health sector and requires the engagement of all sectors, especially finance. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken a heavy toll on economies, businesses, trade, employment. The global economic outlook remains uncertain at best. But we should not be surprised. Recent history teaches us that epidemics and pandemics are a fact of nature, and that they can cause deep social and economic shocks with long-term scarring. Research suggests the 1918 influenza pandemic was the fourth largest economic shock of the 20th century after the two world wars and the Great Depression. In 2003, SARS caused losses of at least 59 billion US dollars, according to the Asian Development Bank. In 2009, the H1N1 pandemic decimated Mexico's tourism and pork industries. In 2014 and 2015, the West African Ebola outbreak caused commodity prices to plummet, led to higher unemployment and fiscal deficits, and prompted the IMF to cut its growth projections for sub-Saharan Africa by 10%. Of course, none of these events have matched the scale of the COVID-19 pandemic, which triggered the deepest global recession since the Second World War. The pandemic is not over, and nor are its economic sequelae. In its most recent World Economic Outlook, the IMF reduced its growth expectations for this year and next. Likewise, the OECD predicts that most advanced economies will return to their pre-pandemic output paths by 2023, but with greater debt and subdued growth potential. The pandemic is therefore presenting us with a dilemma: the need for urgent and significant investments to bolster global health security at a time when many countries are feeling the pinch. Against this backdrop, there is a clear need for smart, evidence-informed investments with the best possible return in terms of lives saved, global economic stability, and long-term growth. As you know, there have been many reviews of the global response to the pandemic, including the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, the G20 High-Level Independent Panel, and several others with more than 200 recommendations. We have analyzed these recommendations and discussed them with the Member States Working Group on Strengthening WHO Preparedness for and Response to Health Emergencies, chaired by Indonesia and the United States. Last month, WHO's Executive Board tasked me with developing a set of proposals on strengthening that architecture to be considered by all member states at the World Health Assembly in May. Complementing that process, and at the request of the G20 Finance and Health Task Force, we have prepared with our colleagues at the World Bank an analysis of the architecture and financing needs and gaps for pandemic preparedness and response to inform your discussions on a potential pandemic financing facility. Crucially, the architecture for global health security must be built on the foundation of several key principles. It must be equitable, with no one left behind. It must be inclusive, with the engagement and ownership of all countries. And it must be multi-sectoral, involving partners from industry and across the One Health spectrum. Building on these principles, the recommendations of the various panels fall into three areas or pillars of global health security. The governance needed to ensure a coherent and coordinated global response, the systems and tools needed to prevent, detect, and respond rapidly to epidemics and pandemics, and the financing needed to support those systems and tools. There is already progress in each of these areas. One of the key recommendations of the independent panel is for a new legally binding instrument to provide the rules of the game for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. As you know, at a special session of the World Health Assembly last year, WHO's 194 member states, including all G20 members, decided to negotiate such an instrument. WHO also supports the independent panel's recommendation for a heads of state council to provide high-level political leadership for rapid and coordinated action. In our view, such a council must be anchored in the constitutional mandate of WHO to ensure political, strategic, and technical coherence. There is also significant progress in enhancing the systems and tools needed for enhanced global health security. Our analysis identifies 5 core elements. First, surveillance, collaborative intelligence, and early warning, which is why last year we established the WHO Hub for Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence in Berlin. Second, prioritize research and equitable access to medical countermeasures and essential supplies, building on lessons learned from the ACT Accelerator and the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, as Minister Budi said. Third, public health and social measures and engaged resilient communities. Fourth, safe and scalable health interventions and resilient health systems to save lives. And fifth, pandemic preparedness and response strategy, coordination, and emergency operations. Evidently, financing each of these elements will require substantial investment, which we estimate at $31 billion per year, consistent with the estimate of the G20 high-level independent panel chaired by Senior Minister Tarman. We estimate that about $20 billion would come from existing and projected domestic and international resources, leaving a gap of $10 billion per year. We see 3 options for closing this gap. First, augmenting the resources of existing institutions, although this would not represent a significant shift from the status quo. Second, consolidating funds from various agencies into a single new entity, which would imply a significant restructuring of global health financing with the risk of further fragmenting the global health architecture. And third, to establish a new dedicated financing facility to be channeled through existing institutions anchored in and directed by WHO's constitutional mandate, inclusive governance, and technical expertise. This is the option recommended by both the independent panel and the G20 high-level panel. Finally, it's clear that at the center of this architecture, the world needs a strong and sustainably financed WHO, with its unique mandate, unique technical expertise, and unique global legitimacy. Any efforts to enhance the governance, systems, and financing of global health security can only succeed if they also enhance WHO's role, defined by the nations of the world in 1948, as the directing and coordinating authority on international health work, as many of the speakers before me say. Excellencies, this discussion about preventing, preparing for, and responding to future epidemics is vital. But we cannot allow it to distract us from the present. We cannot hope to prevent future pandemics if we cannot end this one. We need to be very serious on this one. In particular, we seek your support to fill the financing gap of the $16 billion for the ACT Accelerator to make vaccines, tests, treatments, and PPE available everywhere. Please, as finance, especially this is my call to finance ministers, please fill this gap and let's end this pandemic. The acute phase of it can be ended this year. As many of you have told me, $16 billion is rounding error compared with the macroeconomic impact of the pandemic. Thank you once again to Indonesia for your leadership on this issue, and to all G20 countries for your engagement and support. We look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead as we recover together and recover stronger. Terima kasih, and I thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Desi, and back to you.
Which is very, very important, Dr. Tedros. We cannot prepare for future pandemics unless we actually are able to end this one. And when we're building global or strengthening global health architecture, the fundamentals, the foundation that needs to build on, as Dr. Tedros says, it has to be equitable, it has to be inclusive, it has to be multi-sectoral, it has to be, the response has to be global and well coordinated, and also the regulations have to be legally binding so that all countries stick to it. And most importantly is that there has to be adequate funding as well as a political will and good strategies in order to face it. Now, I would like to turn to you now, Minister Vinnereim, because you are also responsible for development cooperation under the UN system. What are your thoughts on where and how the G20 should prioritize on, and what would you like to see as the outcome and deliverables of this building and strengthening the global health system? Minister Vinnereim, floor is yours.
Thank you, Desi. Thank you so much. And dear colleagues, excellencies, ministries, dear all, allow me first of all to express my appreciation to Indonesia for extending an invitation to Norway on this important event, and let me acknowledge Indonesia's leadership in the G20 Joint Finance and Health Task Force. Very, very important work. Norway, as co-chair of the ACT Accelerator Facilitation Council alongside South Africa, is hugely appreciative towards the G20 countries for their role in the ACT-A Facilitation Council and their financial support. So let me just start by underlining this. And let me say that the ACT-A has proven to be an indispensable mechanism for COVID-19. I hope lessons learned from the ACT-A can be used in our further discussions on how to strengthen this global health system. And as you said, Desi, as I'm also Minister of International Development, and as such, I would like to reflect upon the pandemic preparedness and response, the PPR in short, as a key component of the broader development agenda. Because the virus is spreading faster than ever before, and what started out as a health crisis has become an unprecedented socio-economic crisis globally. It has increased food insecurity globally. And we know that trillions of dollars have been spent on mitigating the impacts of the pandemic, but we are lagging behind. So collective investments to detect and prevent and respond to new infectious threats must be a priority for all of us. IMF and the World Bank have highlighted how PPR is key to ensure macroeconomic stability, and the discussions in New York and in Geneva and in the G20 demonstrates how PPR is a foreign policy issue, and it is a shared responsibility for all of us. We need to use this recognition and this momentum to ensure that PPR is not left to the health sector alone. It must be integrated in a whole of government approach. And I would like to thank Indonesia, Italy, and G20 for keeping this a priority. Act A is our best international mechanism to adapt to the constantly changing pandemic, and it offers us a strategy to help reach globally and agreed targets, and it draws on the strengths of 10 existing partners. Act A has delivered results that would not have been accomplished otherwise. It has delivered 1.2 billion vaccines to some 144 countries through COVAX. The COVAX facility has delivered more than 80% of the vaccines used in low-income countries. Act A has procured more than 200 million COVID-19 tests, and it has increased the supply of oxygen, treatments, protection for healthcare workers. But for Act A to deliver at scale, there is a real urgent need for funding. Some 16 billion US dollars are needed in the coming months to close the financing gap that we have detected. But it should be achievable. In the first funding cycle of Act A, we mobilized 19 billion US dollars. So it should be within reach with political will. As co-chairs of the Act A Facilitation Council, President Ramaphosa of South Africa and our Prime Minister in Norway, Prime Minister Støre, have called upon 55 high and upper middle income countries to contribute a fair share. G20 countries have played an important role so far, so we will count on you as major contributors. And Norway is committed to do its part as well. In December, Norway announced another 220 million US dollars to the second emergency budget of Act A. For 2 years now, we have worked to bring the pandemic under control. We weren't prepared when the pandemic hit. Now we must use lessons learned to transform our ad hoc solutions into sustainable mechanisms for controlling the next pandemic. And let me highlight 4 gaps in the multilateral system that we believe must be addressed. First, a coordinated mechanism that brings existing agencies together. This must be in place when a new infectious threat emerges. A mechanism for research, for development, and to scale up production is needed to prepare for and to respond to new pathogens. And financing must rapidly become available. Second, beyond vaccines and tests and treatments, we need planned and coordinated emergency processes when a crisis hits. So the emergency processes must be in place. Third, in-country delivery is really challenging. Humanitarian crisis response must be linked to longer-term health systems, strengthening and vice versa. So this, what we call the nexus approach, is urgently needed. And fourth, as co-chairs of Act A, we have seen that collective decision-making is needed for accountability and agility. So a stronger governance structure must be ready when the next crisis hits. So far, I've focused on infectious threats. Yet, when we discuss the global health system, we can't only focus on preparedness or on PPR. PPR must be an integrated part of the whole broader developmental agenda. And I believe that global collaboration needs to change if we are to succeed in confronting a next pandemic more efficiently than we did with this one. And this new reality must be used to reform the existing global health system. Now, let me highlight 4 issues on that as well. First, let us avoid fragmentation. We should simplify and incentivize the existing agencies to be better coordinating. I believe that Act A filled a gap without creating new structures. And this, I believe, should serve as an example of new efforts and how new efforts should complement existing structures and not duplicate or create new silos. We really need to avoid duplication. Second, the inclusiveness and legitimacy, and this cannot be highlighted enough, I think. The G20's interest in the global health system is absolutely crucial. However, solutions must go beyond G20. We need to hear the voices of the low-income countries and civil society as well. And only when solutions are inclusive, they will be considered legitimate. Third, the additional and sustainable financing. This is crucial for the PPR. It shouldn't crowd out other investments in health or in food security or in climate change. And this can be done through increased international investments for global public goods, for health security, such as through a financial intermediary fund, which has been mentioned here today. Also, increased domestic investments in health, where PPR should be financed as an integrated part of universal health coverage. And fourth, we need to strengthen the local and regional capacity, including an improved surveillance system. I believe that COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of data and sample sharing. Indonesia put this to the test of pandemic influenza and the pandemic influenza preparedness, the PIP, when framework was agreed, and a broader framework for pathogen sharing is needed. And secondly, the local and regional production of vaccines and treatments. There are multiple positive examples at country level. And I'd like to mention that Norway has recently supported a new WHO mRNA hub. And this depends on technology transfers and licensing arrangements in order to get this local and regional production up and going. So to conclude, let me just repeat 3 key messages. First, we must fully finance Act A to ensure equitable access to COVID-19 tools. And G20 countries are important. Together, you are asked to fund 90% of the Act A needs. Second, the global health system wasn't prepared when the pandemic hit. So let us use lessons learned from the current pandemic to create sustainable mechanisms and financing, including for medical countermeasures. G20 could, in collaboration with the Act A Facilitation Council, ensure a robust evaluation of Act A to inform the establishment of a new permanent platform. And lastly, I urge G20 countries to move forward to ensure sustainable financing. And I look forward to following the discussion of a financing mechanism for pandemic preparedness in the next session of this seminar. As co-chair of ACTA, I thank you for this opportunity and this very important opportunity to participate in this discussion. And Norway is looking forward to taking an active part in the upcoming talks. So thank you, Desi.
Minister Tweedenrijn for this very, very concrete suggestions. And yes, the Act A can be a vehicle, or it's can be used to build on the strengthening of the global architecture. Now, since we did start a little bit late, I think we should have a follow-up questions. And the words that I keep hearing in this discussion is lessons learned. And I think we should explore a little bit more from particularly with Indonesia's experience, Pak Budi. Let's talk about, can you share a little bit about, we had the pandemic, we started the pandemic when COVID-19 first came into Indonesia back in March 2020, and now we are, 2 years ahead. The government is best to vaccinate everybody now. This is also a good time to not only deal with a pandemic, but also creating a good national health system that will be able to address all sorts of health issues, of which we have many here in Indonesia and, of course, across the world. So what would be the lessons that we are learning, especially when we have the SDGs target of 2030? We need to meet our basic universal health coverage for all. So what are we learning from this pandemic, and how is Indonesia strategizing in order to build and strengthen our own national health system?
As Anne has mentioned before, that the preparations for the pandemic can come two ways. The first one is the preparations that country has to do during peacetime, and the other one is the preparations that the country has to do during wartime. And I think we need to emphasize what we have to do and fix during peacetime. And there are several items that that we need to prepare, and also we need the global financing to make sure that every country invested enough to prepare during the peacetime for the wartime. I'll give an example. We need to develop, as I mentioned, a surveillance system that has been taught. But the other one that I would like to share is we need to develop the vaccine as the weapon, to address when the wartime happens. And you understand that vaccine development before took years, more than 10 years. Now with the latest technology, we realize that humanity can develop vaccine in less than a year. So if we can replicate this capacity faster, not only to a few countries, but more countries globally, that will establish a much stronger defense system during peacetime with also enough funding for us to prepare for the next pandemic. So from my perspective, I'm very interested that this mRNA technology to develop vaccine can be distributed globally, both in terms of manufacturing capacity and also research capacity, so humanity are well prepared. And that is also the intention of Indonesia, because we have 270 million populations that we need to have this capacity quickly. I know WHO has initiative to build this thing in South Africa and also in Brazil with the regional office of WHO. And I strongly believe that we need to have it in Asia. India is very strong technologically, and I think Indonesia, as the fourth largest populous country, need to do the same and follow India. Thank you.
Technology transfer, technology know-how is very, very important, obviously. Now, Mr. Speranza, Italy was impacted by COVID-19 quite early on. Perhaps you could tell us your own lessons learned in tackling the pandemic, and also, looking ahead when tackling health issues as a whole. How are you, in your efforts to strengthen your national health system? Are there, new approaches and new strategies?
Yeah, thank you. We received hard lessons from this pandemic season, and of course, the first choice is to invest more. For many years, health has been considered simply a cost. Instead, we think that we have to open a new season in which money that we put in health are considered an investment, not only a cost. And I think this is the most important lesson from a national side. The other huge lesson is that we cannot consider anymore health as national policy. In some of our countries, they are sometimes even considered regional or local policies. Instead, what we really learned during these difficult months is that health is an international question, is an international issue. And that's why we have to work to create a stronger architecture on global governance on health. Of course, from our point of view, WHO is the key role. I appreciate the work and the words pronounced by Tedros in his speech, but we need to work even more to create a stronger architecture on health policies. I think this is the most important lesson we received. Think, for example, just for one moment, about the One Health strategy. One Health strategy means that the health of human beings is fully connected with the health of animals and the health of the environment we live in. This challenge cannot be a national challenge. You can win the One Health strategy only at an international level. That's why the work we are doing together as G20 Ministers of Health, G20 Ministers of Finance, it's really fundamental. And the real point now, we see the light out of the tunnel, but now we have to change. There are the conditions to transform the crisis we have been in a great opportunity to open a new season based on investments on health and investment on new international relations, a new international dialogue on health. This is my opinion.
The pandemic has shown how globally connected we are as a world. Now, Dr. Tedros, of course, as you know, World Organization, your own lessons learned when it comes to global response, coordinated response. What have you learned, and what can be done better when it comes to basically educating the public and also generating a much more concerted effort in trying to tackle this pandemic together and getting all the science of it, on the health protocols, the quarantine measures, vaccines and drugs and so on and so forth. What would you say your own lessons learned in how to go forward from this ongoing pandemic?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think many of our colleagues, excellencies, have actually said it. One lesson will be understanding once and for all the centrality of health. Health is an investment. It's not a cost. It's not a waste. So having this joint meeting of finance ministers and ministers of health, I think will help in addressing the previous problem that health as a cost and move now into health as an investment. So the centrality of health, I think, is very, very clear now. It affected our politics, affected our social fabric, affected our economy, affected everything, not only our health conditions. So that's one lesson. The second lesson is even the high-income countries were surprised because their investment was on high-tech medical technologies rather than on public health, on health promotion and disease prevention. If you remember, we had Ebola from 2018 up to the end of 2019, almost 2 years. Of course, it didn't cross. It didn't go outside DRC. We managed to contain it, and during that Ebola outbreak, and it's a conflict area, as you know, North Kivu, areas called Beni, Butembo, and Katwa. But within that conflict area, we were following up or doing contact tracing almost 25,000 a day. But when the COVID pandemic hit, even in countries with the highest or the strongest economy, couldn't do contact tracing because it's not because they can't do it, because they were not prepared to do that. They were not investing in public health. I think it's time now to give attention to public health and invest in public health, including, as Minister Speranza said, the One Health approach is really key. It's part of that. And then the other maybe important thing to focus is, or lessons we have learned, as I say, I believe, politics, instead of supporting science, sometimes it was going contrary. Politics can be beneficial or it could be negative. It's the way you use it. If it supports the science, it can enhance it. If it goes contrary to the science, it undermines it. And then people will be divided along political ideologies and they will follow their respective leaders. Especially we have seen in some countries where there is no unity and some of the leaders saying this and others saying the other thing. So I think this is one lesson, and we have to make sure that there is a solution for that. And of course, there are other lessons that we have learned. I know surveillance related to the genomic, especially sequence, that Minister Budi said is one lesson, because we have to strengthen the surveillance. There is a serious gap in the surveillance, and artificial intelligence, genomic surveillance, what we say collaborative intelligence is key. That's why we have now the hub in pandemic and epidemic intelligence hub in Berlin, and it's going very well. And this can be supported by the biohub, which we established in Switzerland. That sharing of pathogens is very important. Many countries are not willing to share, but we're establishing this system, and some have already started volunteering to share, started sharing voluntarily, and this will also address especially the problems around surveillance, as we have learned from our the lessons. The last one is, I don't want to take your time, the fourth and last lesson, of course, lots of lesson, is lack of rule of game, a global one. As you know, even countries cannot be governed if there is no law. The need for law is to govern, countries, especially national level. And then globally, for a common problem, common threats like this one, we need to have a rule of game that can ensure obligation by all countries. Of course, we have the IHR, but that's not complete. And that's why we're asking for pandemic treaty now, to have pandemic treaty, and there is progress. I think that's also a good lesson. Not having a rule of law really costed us a lot. So now we need to have the rule of the game, a treaty that can guide, as you rightly said, something that can bring uniformity in our response, cooperation in our response, obligation in our response, so there is no anarchy like what we have seen during this pandemic. So I could put this four as major, and all of them have solutions. We're now, many of them in the pipeline, implementing. The ACTA is one that, of course, not only for the future, by the way, what we're building now, ACTA started actually at the beginning as a solution to the problem we're facing, and it's working well. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank Norway and South Africa for their leadership. Last week we launched the $23.4 billion request. That's what my sister Anne also underlined today. So to finance ministers, again, please help us fill the gap of the 16 billion. The two leaders, Prime Minister Sture and President Ramaphosa, have already written letters to you, and I hope you will take that seriously, have the money, and end this pandemic, the acute phase of this pandemic this year, because everybody is sick and tired. I think everybody wants to see this pandemic over and go into a normalcy. Thank you, and back to you, Sawi.
I'm your own lessons learned in Norway. I mean, what I see from this pandemic is countries sort of implement different ways of tackling it, imposing different health protocols and quarantines and so forth. Well, what about from your own part of the world?
Thank you, Desi. And first of all, let me say how much I appreciate this dialogue. It has been very, very interesting, and I'd like to echo some of the important points highlighted by Minister Esperanza on the One Health approach, and Dr. Tedros on his important appeal here at the end. So thank you. To your question, simply put, I think the key challenge now is the delivery and the rollout. We need to get the shots into the arms. So, and this needs to be addressed from a systems perspective. And the delivery challenges that we are facing today globally can't be understood in isolation. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic is a very complex challenge. It has multiple direct and indirect effects. So we need action across the end-to-end value chain, all the way from research and development to jabbing the arms. And looking back at the handling of the pandemic thus far, I would say that attention has been paid to different parts of the value chain and a little bit in isolation along the way. 2020 might be seen as the year for research and development of vaccines. Last year, 2021, the main challenge was the limited supply. We needed to speed up production. Now, I believe that this year, 2022, our key challenge will be the delivery. And vaccines are not efficient until people are actually vaccinated. And each part of this value chain must be strengthened to meet the global needs. And this value chain does not only include vaccines, it includes tests, treatments, preventive measures as well. And while we work to address the long-term system challenges, we also need to ask, what is the most important thing to focus on right now? What is the main task at hand right now? And I believe that the inequalities in access to vaccines are very stark between countries and within countries. Now, the increasing supply of vaccine is very good news in order to level out the inequality of vaccines. But the main challenge now is the equitable rollout. So collectively, we must address the supply and demand side barriers in countries that are lagging behind. And we need to do that based on local needs, local design. That ranges from ensuring cold chains to mitigating vaccine hesitancy. And COVID vaccines must be made available in humanitarian settings. Let us not forget that. And the approach to vaccination must be inclusive, because we do not want to leave anyone behind. So just to sum up, I want to return to the end-to-end approach to vaccines and tests and treatments. While we make efforts on delivery, we cannot forget the need to strengthen the parts of the chain as well. And I trust that the G20 will prioritize delivery of vaccines, of tests and treatments, and funding ACT-A this year, alongside taking the bold steps we need to make us better prepared for whatever comes next. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Minister Svidharam Pak Budi. We've got a lot of feedbacks and inputs for how Indonesia, where we can proceed in building the global health architecture, and of course the essential elements, the foundations in order to build a global health architecture. It has to be, first of all, it has to be equitable. It has to be inclusive. It has to be multi-sectoral. Global response needs to be coordinated. Of course, most important also is adequate funding. Dr. Tedros mentioned several times the amount needed in order to get us through. For them, you mentioned there has to be access to essential health resources, particularly for developing countries such as Indonesia. And this is overcoming the pandemic requires a lot of, or any other health issues, requires a lot of research and development. There has to be technology sharing, data sharing. There has to be global manufacturing hubs that can create and produce important health, essential health resources at an affordable and also accessible way. And I'm afraid that's all the time we have for. Once again, please, for those of you here in the Jakarta Convention Center, please give a big hands to our speakers, Minister Budi here in Jakarta. We have Minister Speranza in Italy, Dr. Tedros, I believe, in Switzerland, and also Minister Svidharam in Norway. Once again, thank you so much. I hope that this discussion has been a very fruitful one, and I hope it's a good foundation for Indonesia to kick off the G20 meeting for this year. Once again, thank you very much, and I would like to return this event to our moderator, Faisal.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kadesi. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now gone through the first session very well. I am sure that there must be much new insight that we may receive from the speakers. We really thank you to the panelists. In the first session, we have Minister of Health of Indonesia, Director General of World Health Organization, Minister of Health of Italy, and Minister of International Development of Norway as the panelists from the first session. We also would like to say thank you to Kak Desi Anwar for having facilitated the fruitful discussion in the first session.
My pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say once again that this high-level seminar on strengthening global health architecture is co-organized by the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia and the Central Bank of Indonesia. This is one of the side events of the first Finance Minister and Central Bank Governors meeting. And as our time is quite short, we will now soon move to the second session of the seminar, in which we will talk about mobilizing financing for global public goods. In the second session of the seminar, we will have several panelists. The first one is Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and then President of the World Bank Group, Minister of Finance of India, and Senior Minister of Singapore. All right, welcome back. Welcome to the high-level seminar on strengthening global health architecture. This is one of the side events of the first meeting of the Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting. We will now move on to the second session of the seminar. As I have mentioned earlier, that there will be some panelists, and those panelists will be further introduced by our moderator. In this occasion, we would like to invite Senior Anchor of Metro TV, Kania Sutiswaninata, to facilitate the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, let me invite to the stage Kania Sutiswaninata. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Faisal, for that introduction. Hello, very good afternoon, Excellencies, to all distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, joining us here in Jakarta and also joining us through our digital channel. Again, welcome. This is the second session of the high-level seminar on strengthening global health architecture. My name is Kanya Sutisnawinata, and it's such a great honor for me to be moderating for this session. And as was mentioned earlier, I think it was again mentioned, the topic of the second session is mobilizing financing for global public goods. A lot of it was also covered on the first session. And concerning this topic in light of these past 2 years, I think it is quite the challenging task, but necessary, or as Dr. Tedros earlier mentioned, it's vital as a way to move forward. And because as we have learned, resources and also financing are just not distributed or not available equitably. And the ones that are suffering the most are the country with the lesser resources. So going forward to accelerate the end of the COVID-19 crisis that we are facing right now, and also to prepare for a future pandemic, we need to be able to close the financing gap. We need to acknowledge the funding required for a coordinated prevention, preparedness, and also response on a global level, and also highlight the importance of acknowledging health as a global public good. So in short, a global collective action that needs a global financing scheme, one that would complement existing resources and that would support all countries to respond better to a common global threat and also minimize the cost they incur. So in this session, we would like to discuss and perhaps explore more on the possible financing modalities, as was mentioned by the Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati, perhaps possibly a new financing scheme that would bring the most value for both for countries, all countries, both donors and also recipient countries. So it is my honor. All of my panelists are joining me online for this session from all over the world, and it is my honor to present the following distinguished speakers to join me through via online. First is the Treasury of the United States, Her Excellency Janet Yellen. Minister of Finance of India, Her Excellency Nirmala Sitharaman. President of the World Bank Group, Mr. David Malpass, and Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies of Singapore, as well as co-chair of the G20 High-Level Independent Panel, His Excellency Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Excellencies.
Hi.
Greetings from Jakarta. Such a pleasure and such an honor to have all of you in this session. Although we are quite separated by the distance, of course, nonetheless, let's just jump right in and discuss about the second topic that is equally important as the first one, which is mobilizing financing for public goods. I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to start with Secretary Yellen. The financing gap was mentioned again and again in the first session. How do we address the financing gap needed, and how do we get the commitment for all countries to invest through a system that is permanent and robust on a global level? And particularly, how do we enlist developed nations to provide more funding, provide more financing for global public goods, and how do we incentivize advanced countries to make this happen? Secretary Yellen.
COVID-19 has really underscored the critical role of health in economies and how an emerging infectious disease in one country can pose a threat to every other country. We've all seen how failing to address gaps in health and preparedness leads to costly and extensive and third order effects. Pandemic preparedness is a global public good, as you said, one that is consistently overlooked on political agendas, and it's chronically underfunded, both in developed and developing countries. I think there's no question that the World Health Organization has a central role as the lead for global public health. The WHO should have sustainable financing so it can fulfill its core functions. And we look forward to the continuing work of our health counterparts and all WHO member states to address this issue. Incentivizing financing for health and pandemic preparedness and response is really critical. The G20 high-level independent panel and other experts have consistently highlighted that underfunding of health and preparedness gaps leave the world vulnerable to the next pandemic threat. For developed economies, we need to consider resources for health system strengthening as investments that yield high returns in building resilience to health shocks rather than simply spending. Low and middle income countries need to boost their health system budgets, but also require concessional sources to help shift incentives. Given the global nature of pandemics, investments to build resilience in health systems have positive externalities for both developed and developing countries. The G20 took an important step in establishing the Finance Health Task Force to examine and achieve progress on priorities at the intersection of health and finance. The task force can engage experts and policymakers on issues like this, identifying and advancing incentives and accountability needed to overcome persistent gaps in both external and domestic financing of global public goods. The current system just hasn't been providing the funding needed to address identified country capacity gaps, such as for disease surveillance and workforce capacities. A financial intermediary fund would provide a dedicated financing mechanism with accountability to drive resources toward this underaddressed issue. We have seen mechanisms like this advance progress in areas like climate and specific disease areas. This fund could incentivize low and middle income countries to leverage their existing resources, including country and regional IDA allocations to spend on health. And the fund could also catalyze investments from diverse resources, including from the private sector. In addition, we're continuing to work with partners on the IMF Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is an innovative instrument through which countries, particularly developed countries, can channel special drawing rights to provide balance of payment support to developing countries as they address structural challenges. The RST can help address global public goods needs for pressing global issues with a shared call to action, like climate change and our focus here, pandemic preparedness. So we support these mechanisms. We think they're important elements of a multifaceted solution which align with and complement WHO efforts.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Moving on to Minister Sitaraman. Now, we also recognize that promoting collective action to respond to the pandemic is essential to accelerate the end of the COVID-19 pandemic while also preparing for a future one. But we also recognize that the growing difference in income across countries, lower income countries with limited fiscal space and also underfunded health system will require more support from donors. So tell us, Minister, what are the main challenges right now for EMs to access the existing financing, and how can a new mechanism that was proposed earlier overcome these challenges?
Well, thank you for having this discussion. I think it's very timely, and it is got to be addressed in all earnestness. I'll, if anything, start with the quotation or a line that former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan had expressed at some point in time. He said, while speaking of international cooperation, he said that global public goods is that one missing term in the equation when we are trying to work with international cooperation. So the criticality of global public goods has been recognized, and it is that on which today there is quite a lot of discussion in the context of the health and the climate crisis. You're right in pointing out that the crisis of mobilizing resources is acute in low-income countries and middle-income countries. Their own fiscal space for generating that kind of increase in funding health-related and climate issue-related matters is very limited. And if I can just quote one number, which will be useful for us to understand how India had to, because of the size of our population and also because of the way in which our government prioritized creating of assets, I would like to just draw your attention to the figure. And that was for a country like India, quite a big amount, but we realized the value of it. And therefore, 29 billion US dollars were given for health infrastructure mission, in which health insurance was assured for the poor and for the low income groups. That mission actually supported the extended health service which had to be given for the people during the pandemic, that also undertook missions capacity for expanding on the infrastructure, basic infrastructure in far-flung areas which have not been so planned to have better infrastructure during normal times. But this pandemic actually has helped us to bridge the gap between the resources and also the requirement in the ground. But this is a case study of India, where global public good is something which has now become a debate, where we realize that the committee appointed by the G20 has done commendable work in calling for attention of the community, the G20 community, to see how best we can achieve fund mobilization so that the gaps between institutions which have to multilaterally address this issue can be filled up. And for which I think the discussion very clearly will have to look up to see how nations with their limited funds can help bring in that kind of initial money. Also make sure that we're able to get the ODA, multilateral funding, all of them together, and treat them as capitalist funds so that we are able to generate from private philanthropies, from the markets, such resources which will be helpful. Otherwise, it's just not possible for the small fiscal amounts that these low-income countries can generate, but generate which is insufficient to raise money from the market capital or behave like a capitalist fund which can help in generating resources. So new ways of thinking, bringing in multilateral funding, also making sure that countries can come up with grants which can be given to such small and low-income countries. We have to evolve methodologies through which we can adapt new ways of funding to fill those gaps which exist between multilateral institutions, and all of which we'll have to address two important lessons that we have learned during this pandemic. The first lesson is the preparedness was not adequate. The second lesson was amounts which we could spare was also, the money which we could spare was not also adequate. And therefore, although all of us had our hearts in the right place, our hands were tied because we weren't effectively ready for such a crisis. So I would think these are the ways in which the high-level committee, having done this work and recognized that all of us will have to contribute towards global public goods, is the way I would think before us, for all of us to walk together hand in hand.
Very well. was quite the message. All of us needs to contribute. So let's go to President Malpass then, just to give your thoughts as well. I think that we all agree that financing for a pandemic PPR has to become more adequate and also more sustainable and better coordinated, and also require a continuous coordination between health and also finance decision makers. But how do you think the new financing mechanism, the new ways of financing the gap should define the element of sustainability in this case, President Malpass?
Hello, and I would like to say very good day to my colleagues around the world and to the panel here. It's good to see everyone, and I'm pleased to be discussing this vital topic. The World Bank Group works extensively on health systems around the developing world to bolster preparedness and provide a variety of surge financing. We've been actively engaged in the G20 Finance and Health Task Force. We prepared the joint paper on financing needs with WHO and look forward to your views. The paper identifies significant financing gaps to strengthen preparedness. The world needs to be much better prepared to respond to pandemics, catastrophes, and health emergencies. Investing in prevention and preparedness now will save lives and over the medium term will save resources. Since the COVID-19 pandemic is not yet behind us, let me say a few words about our efforts to support countries through this pandemic. I'll then turn to the topic of preparedness and financing for future health crises. The World Bank Group's $157 billion response to COVID-19 was unprecedented. It was the fastest and largest growth in our history. This helped countries evaluate their health capacity gaps, finance their health systems, secure vaccines, and turn those vaccines into actual vaccinations in the poorest countries. As of last week, our financing has helped 67 countries purchase over 500 million doses. The doses are closely connected to our financing of country deployment programs and monitoring through workforce training, public awareness campaigns, logistics, cold chain capacity, syringes, and testing kits. Preparedness and building for the future are core to the World Bank's mission through comprehensive health projects. We are working to strengthen health systems in over 100 countries with an active portfolio totaling $30 billion. The IFC has been actively helping to expand emerging market vaccine production, especially in Africa, and make available critically needed equipment and supplies through its $4 billion global health platform. We've been working closely with in-country partners throughout the pandemic and with international and regional partners such as UNICEF, WHO, Gavi, COVAX, the African Union, AVAT, and PAHO. In Africa, we've been working with countries and regional groups and agencies to strengthen disease surveillance, early warning systems, laboratory testing capacity, and human resources. A good example is the Regional Disease Surveillance Systems Enhancement Project, which supports 16 countries in West and Central Africa with financing from both IDA and IBRD. We are also supporting the Africa CDC, which was created in the aftermath of the Ebola crisis. To improve coordination, we formed the Multilateral Leaders Task Force, along with the IMF, WHO, and WTO. The MLTF is taking a data-driven, evidence-based approach to help identify and solve critical bottlenecks. I want to shift now to capital structures. It's vital that structures aimed at preparedness have this type of flexibility to provide surges during crises and the sustainable support needed for longer-term health preparedness. The huge surge in World Bank financing was enabled by several key aspects of the World Bank's financial structure, including the recent IBRD and IFC capital increases, the IBRD's crisis buffer, which was explicitly designed to respond to crises, and IDA's ability to front load its support and accelerate its access to global capital markets. With strong support from members, we moved quickly to bring forward IDA 19 resources and accelerate the IDA 20 replenishment. Already in 2022, IDA issued a 20-year euro-denominated sustainable development bond that raised 2 billion euro and was heavily oversubscribed. IBRD has also been actively working with borrowers to help them lock in fixed rates. Pandemic preparedness requires long-term, sustained, predictable financing. With your generous contributions, the IDA 20 replenishment package includes ambitious commitments to support countries to strengthen pandemic preparedness and response. We're also in active discussions with several IBRD countries on how best to support their national plans to strengthen these aspects. We need to continue to innovate the financing vehicles available for pandemic preparedness. The World Bank offers catastrophe deferred drawdown options, CAT DDOs, for pandemic-related events, as we do for natural disasters. These contingent lines of credit provide immediate liquidity to countries in the event of a pandemic outbreak or high-impact disaster. It is based on governments adopting the policy and institutional measures to improve their pandemic preparedness upfront. A recent example of that is a $300 million credit line for Colombia that was approved in December 2021. We are working rapidly on a new financial intermediary fund, or FIF, to increase financing for pandemic preparedness and response. A key part of the FIF's effectiveness will be the financial contributions from G20 countries and other donors. The new FIF will bring additional resources, complement ongoing efforts, and enhance coordination on this critical agenda. I would like to particularly commend Secretary Yellen and the United States for their support and leadership on this initiative. Key principles should underpin the facility. First, flexibility to work through strong implementing institutions drawing on their comparative advantages. Second, mobilization of long-term resources on a sustained and predictable basis. Third, avoid duplication and ensure complementarity with existing financing efforts and institutions. Fourth, a focus on strengthening coordination among partners. And fifth, simplicity in governance and design with agile and streamlined operating processes. As we work together to end this pandemic, we must draw on the lessons we have learned to help prepare the world for the next global health emergency. Developing countries deserve more and better financial support from the international community that is aligned with their needs. Strong political leadership, commitment, and domestic investments are equally critical. And across all these important issues, COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of coordinated action in fighting global threats like pandemics and other similarly widespread crises. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, President Malpass. I will follow up with some questions later on, but we have to move on to Senior Minister Shanmugaratnam, who is also co-chair of the G20 High-Level Independent Panel, to give his insight. You know, to ensure coordination in between international finance institutions, the WHO and other international organizations is one thing, but to avoid duplication, it was mentioned several times earlier, will require the need to come together and perhaps in unprecedented ways. So what is the governance mechanism in in this new financing scheme that would ensure complementary but not duplication? Senior Minister.
Thank you. Let me build on what my fellow panelists have just said. And by the way, I really salute Janet and David for being up so early in the morning and joining us. I think we've had a very good set of points already, and the opening session was also excellent, starting with Minister Sri Mulyani's opening remarks, which I thought were really to the point. I think we all agree that two things are virtually certain. First, Omicron is not the last variant in the COVID pandemic. And second, COVID is not by any means the last pandemic, and in fact, it may be the forerunner of something that is worse to come. So, recognizing those two certainties means that we do not have the luxury between either focusing only on COVID and then waiting for some other time before we start preparing for the future. Neither can we simply focus on preparedness for the next pandemic without addressing today's crisis. And what we have to do is to avoid this either-or thinking. And I say this because I notice there's some tension in the discussions that we have in various fora. Some tensions between this idea that, well, if you start talking about the next pandemic, what are we doing about today? There's also some tension between the idea of strengthening multilateralism versus the idea of working with existing institutions. And both these tensions, I think, reflect false choices. The either-or choice, that you either focus on COVID or you focus on the next pandemic, or that you either focus on building up existing institutions or you build up multilateralism. Those are false choices. We have to build both. We have to address COVID urgently, and we have to address with urgency as well the preparations for the next pandemic, and indeed the need to build up public health systems in the interim. We have to focus on building up multilateralism, and we must make the most, and we must enhance the roles of the existing institutions. It's not an either-or. So when we think about our governance mechanisms, when we think about the new financial facility that has been proposed, and I think President David Malpass put it extremely well when he laid out those principles for the FIF. The FIF is not just about preparing for something in a distant future. What we do to use the FIF will have immediate utility in a continuing COVID pandemic. It will have utility in building up public health systems and addressing chronic diseases after we are past COVID-19 pandemic. And it will, of course, be critical in preparing for the next pandemic. The highest rate of investment and the greatest cost effectiveness is going to come in initiatives that address all those three things together. First, dealing as much as we can with the continuing COVID pandemic so as to shorten it and bring it to an end as soon as possible. Dealing with chronic diseases and improving public health once we are past this pandemic, and preparing for the next pandemic so we never again see the cost that we've seen over the last 2 years. And each of the users of the FIF, each of the users of a new multilateral facility has to reflect that triple objective of having immediate utility, having utility beyond this pandemic, and preparing with much more robust capacities to be able to avoid the next pandemic, and if it does come, to be able to sharply reduce its costs. Each of the basic users, what are those basic users? First, surveillance, clearly critical, and I support very strongly Indonesia's proposal for a global genomic data sharing platform. Absolutely critical. It starts with local population level epidemiological monitoring systems. It requires regional and global genomic sequencing capabilities. It requires data sharing. It requires a major step up in the entire network, building on existing hubs as well as strengthening it with new hubs. And the WHO hub in Berlin clearly will be playing a central role. But we are nowhere near having built out that global surveillance network. So that's critical and will be of immediate utility because we are going to get more variants in COVID. We are going to be able to have to assess the effectiveness of vaccines continually. The game is not over yet, even in today's pandemic. So we are building for the future, but it has immediate applicability. That's the first use, surveillance. The second critical requirement, which a FIF will have to help catalyze, is in building out the manufacturing capacity globally for diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics. And again, the Indonesians, building on the Italian presidency, have put forward a cogent proposal, which we have to develop. That's been the big lesson of COVID. The big lesson of COVID is that if we're not prepared in advance of a pandemic, it's too late. If we're not prepared with the capacity in advance of a pandemic to manufacture at speed and scale the vaccines, the therapeutics, the diagnostics, the PPEs, and so forth, it's too late. We'll have a much longer pandemic with a great cost to nations rich and poor, and it's just an unacceptable human cost as well. So we must build now the capacity with immediate use in COVID-19 itself, particularly when you talk about vaccine manufacturing capacity, but we must think beyond COVID as well about its uses in normal times where we have a whole set of chronic diseases that still plague a large part of the world's population. The technologies have now progressed where we can use the facilities that we are putting in place now, build them out further, use the new technologies to be able to address not just the disease we've just had and we are still having, but existing chronic diseases as well. And the mRNA technologies and other new technologies are allowing for facilities that can address multiple diseases. And that's absolutely critical. And not just vaccines, but also therapies, including long-acting injectable therapies. The technologies are progressing. So it's extremely important that we think of the manufacturing capacity in those terms. Do as much as we can with urgency to build out that capacity for continuing COVID pandemic. Use that capacity as fully as we can beyond this pandemic to improve public health and address the critical needs of populations which are still plagued by chronic diseases, and build that capacity in advance of the next pandemic. That's the second major use of an FIF. And the third major use, which my colleague Nirmala Sitharaman highlighted as well, is really building country and regional level preparedness. And what we do today has to be part of how we improve tomorrow. Everything we do, building up the trained manpower, the cold chains, the communications channels, the digital data sharing infrastructure, everything we do today is not just for today, but it's also what we've got to keep using after this pandemic, and is what we really have to have in place before the next pandemic. Finally, just let me say that the other either or we have to avoid in our minds is this idea that we either focus on existing institutions, existing global health organizations, or multilateralism. It's not an either or. We need to build up both, and they have to complement each other. The existing organizations perform an extremely useful role in disease surveillance, in infection controls, in a whole set of for a whole set of diseases as well as a whole set of interventions. But it is a siloed landscape. We all know that. It's highly fragmented. And as was mentioned by one of our colleagues in the previous panel, fragmentation has been the big lesson coming out of COVID. We were too fragmented, and as a result, we found it very hard to organize in time, to raise adequate resources in time, and to deploy effectively. We've got to do much, much better the next time round. And it means not just building up and enhancing the roles of the existing organizations, but we have to strengthen multilateralism. We must strengthen multilateralism and do it in a way that complements the existing institutions, fertilizes funding for the existing institutions, as well as attracting new funding from philanthropies as well as from governments. It's critical that we follow those principles that David Malpass highlighted earlier on when we think about the FIF. Simplicity of governance, not duplicating existing funding, but complementing it, becoming a value add on the system. And I believe it can be done. And the better we achieve that complementarity, the higher will be the return on investment. The higher will be the return on investment in terms of social returns. So even if we're talking about grants, it's really the social returns that we want to maximize. Let me just say in concluding, and again, I say this because I've been watching very carefully the discussions that take place at multiple levels, the more junior officials, the deputies, the ministers, and so on. Many of us are finance ministers or former finance ministers. I would just say we need a sense of financial realism and responsibility in all of this. To say that we don't have enough money to invest for the future, is to me as a finance minister for many years, something that's going to cost our own taxpayers a lot of money. A lot of money. Because if after everything we've been through and the costs we've been through, human and economic, we say that we don't have the modest resources necessary to prevent the same thing from happening in future, is an extremely costly position to take for us as finance ministers, quite apart from being morally irresponsible. So we have to make these relatively modest investments, pool our resources together, and make these investments in the future, and think in investment terms. This is not just spending, it's an investment. And as Robert Speranza, our Italian colleague, said in an earlier panel, as the HLIP had set out last year, the amounts of money required compared to the cost of a future pandemic, even on conservative assumptions as to what that cost will be, you're really talking about 700 to 1. The cost will be 700 times larger than the amounts of money required each year for us to put up in additional international financing. So it's a compelling financial case, and we need that sense of financial realism as well as financial responsibility. And I know the domestic problems many countries face. We all have domestic problems. We have to put aside money for the future that's not for immediate benefit, but is going to be of great benefit to our populations. One of the purposes of a multilateral mechanism, both a governance mechanism that brings together finance and health ministers from an inclusive G20 plus group, plus an FIF, a multilateral financing mechanism that as many countries as possible contribute to. One of the advantages of that is that it helps us in our domestic narrative as well, because we all play our part. We all play our part by pooling resources and investing in the future, and it's easier for us to do it in many countries if we are doing it multilaterally. So let me just end there. I think to borrow my good friend Nirmala's metaphor a short while ago, we can have our hearts in the right place, and we can join together our hands to not only save a lot of lives in the future, but to improve the quality of life in normal times as well. We can do it. It's affordable. It's doable. Thank you.
Build that capacity, and we need to be able to use all the existing resources and also financial institutions that are existing right now. But going back to Secretary Yellen to just give also an overview on a collective tone, like how Secretary Yellen, you have a remark that you would like to give as well, that you would have given initially in the first session, but how can everybody wins and get the financing support needed while also ensuring fairness in the process, uh, for all countries, both the donors and also the recipient countries, Secretary Yellen?
Well, I think the work of the high-level panel presents us with a road forward that will meet all of those objectives. A multilateral mechanism for health and finance collaboration, which is something that was clearly missing before COVID-19. I think the G20 Finance Health Task Force is a good starting point to explore more systematic and formal cooperation. This is a mechanism that will allow finance and health ministries from around the globe to come together to discuss issues related to pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. It will be a collaboration that will be critical in detecting and containing the next deadly pathogen so it doesn't spread to become a regional or global pandemic, with the devastating impact on our people and our economies we have seen this time. So it's a mechanism that will help us synchronize health policy prioritization and finance decisions, and I think bring in voices from regional groups, from diverse and often underrepresented perspectives to the global conversation. And we complement that by creating this financial intermediary fund that will mobilize the funding that we need, that my colleagues have described, to fill the financing gaps that exist in the current architecture. And I think following the recommendations of the high-level panel, we're going to be able to do a great deal to address vulnerabilities relating to future pandemics. And I think it's important that the global community come together in the far-sighted way that Tarman has just described, to make sure that we don't suffer the enormous health and economic consequences that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused the globe.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Also, a remark that you would like to give?
That's fine. I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So moving on to Minister Sitaraman, when we talk about better coordination, stronger coordination, you also believe that, a stronger coordination between health and also finance decision makers is one of the elements that would support a stronger global health system. What outcomes do you hope this stronger collaboration and coordination will produce when we take into account, the perspective of the lower and middle income countries?
As we all have been talking about, trying to maximize the available resources within a country, commit oneself for today's pandemic, and also look at investing for future preparedness. And in that, out of the box ways of thinking, and also looking at blended finance, where the resources that are available for you within your country become catalytic fund, because this way we will be able to address issues which are related to small and medium income countries. When you look at using their own fund as catalytic fund, and look at public and philanthropic funds going into it, create the catalytic effect, and mobilize additional private sector funds, you are able to come up with funds enough to take care of future investments. Thurman constantly refers to it as very modest, which is required, modest fund which is required. Otherwise, the offset for it is not really much. But what the future cost will be otherwise is quite high, is a point which all of us will have to look at. And then also hope that IMF's new SDR allocations, which were essentially used earlier and also would also be used now to help low-income countries so that they can invest in their own health systems and for related expenditure. But the preparedness aspect of what we are experiencing now raises serious concerns, because when we were dealing with the pandemic, the kind of common pool resources that we had to gather, mobilize, and then redistribute for the low-income countries were very, which are material for healthcare, good healthcare, whether they were syringes or PPE kits and so on. So for a future pandemic, that's the kind of preparedness we should have, particularly keeping the low and middle income countries in mind. Nothing which will be simple can be excluded. At the same time, nothing that which is going to be far from being affordable can be rejected for them. So we'll have to have a pool of things readied so that a future pandemic doesn't ignore simple things, nor does it overprice the very complicated or very expensive items, so that the middle income countries or low income countries don't get the worse for it. So we need to have a preparedness which is transparently managed, which is multilaterally supported, because eventually all this will have to be done through multilateral institutions. And therefore, the WHO's centrality is not being undermined at all. But yet, even WHO's own ways of doing things and also mobilizing capabilities need strong augmentation. And that is what is going to help us help those countries which cannot help themselves when such crises related to the pandemic or even climate crisis take place. So that is the way I would think we can all stand up together to help in emergency situations of health and climate.
Malpass then, when we talk about this new mechanism, how would when we talk about emergency situations that was mentioned just now, how do we ensure that the new mechanism will offer quick and also unbureaucratic process to financing in the event of another major outbreaks, since timely response is also essential, President Malpass?
Of the new fifth, as Secretary Yellen said, the goal is to mobilize funding to help fill the financing gap. And part of that financing gap is the short term, the immediate need in the event of a crisis. World Bank has tools that I described for that, the IDA front loading, for example, and the IBRD cushion, and also the CAT DDO bonds, which are all very important. And I think new innovation of short-term financing mechanisms is also possible through the fifth. If I may, also as part of this, it will be important to have a focus on what the preparedness is. We work with countries now on how they can set up their systems so that they can respond to crises. And it turns out to be a difficult and challenging endeavor for a lot of countries due to the capacity constraints, to mention one of them. So I would say that we need to think about country platforms that pull together the best efforts of various multilateral institutions working with countries that are really trying to move forward and do the preparation that's needed. That would be an important mechanism of the new fifth.
So then to add on that, when we talk about the new financing scheme and also mechanism, I mean, how do we ensure fairness? I would be asking you the same question as well. You've identified gaps in building resiliency, especially in preparedness for future pandemics, but also to end the COVID-19 crisis right now. So when we talk about distributing resources and also in terms of the donors and also the recipient countries, how would you quantify fairness? How would you do it? How do we get the accountability to make sure that, as you said earlier, that the cost incurred in the future will be much lower than the investment that we are making right now?
That's, to me, we think a lot about fairness. That's been a critical issue in the vaccine distribution system, but it means it's a complex issue when you have different types of vaccines. So what we think is important in measuring fairness is, do individual countries have access to the types of vaccines and to the therapeutics and to the deployment systems that work best in their countries. So as you think of a health preparedness system for the long term, it's going to be very different in different countries. So you can't measure fairness by in the form of identical in each place. Or what you can have, I think, is a basic checklist. What is necessary for a country to be prepared, and then you can build from there.
Very Very well then. I think we have another round for a last remark from all His Excellencies or Her Excellencies that are present in this session. First, I'd like to give the opportunity to Secretary Yellen to give her last remarks concerning this topic. What would be your expectations moving forward, Secretary Yellen?
Thanks very much for that question. In concluding, let me just emphasize the tremendous importance I attach to both focusing on being prepared for future pandemics by establishing and getting up and running quickly this global health and finance ministers task force. At the same time that we continue to have urgent need to address the current pandemic, we really need to learn the lessons that it's taught us to do what we need to do to be prepared for the next one so that its toll, its human toll, and its economic toll is not as large as this one. This is such a worthwhile investment, and a financial intermediary fund will be a very critical ingredient in making this work.
And moving on to Minister Sitranaman, the same question to you. What would be your expectations moving forward?
It's apparent now from all that has been discussed from the morning and even in this panel that investment should happen now for a safer future is agreed upon. I agree with Mr. Malpass on the fact that basic list should be there, a checklist of what is absolutely necessary for all countries, particularly the poor and the middle income. So unless that checklist is ticked off by each of the countries, we wouldn't serve their requirement, and that has to be done speedily. And that is where some work has to be readied. Even better will also have to be the second silo, that is, even better would be to make sure that the financing modalities are absolutely based on sustainable and viable principles of sustainability and viability, and that the independent governance takes over the moment these funds are mobilized and something is there in the kitty for us to deal with it, for getting vaccines or everything else distributed to the poorer countries. We need to have an independent governance mechanism, even if they are located in multilateral institutions, and keep principles of inclusivity, transparency, and equity in mind. And then the shortfalls will have to be every now and then filled up. And finally, increased funding would be needed from multilateral development banks, resilient and sustainability trusts being created by the IMF must keep pandemic preparedness in mind. And therefore, the principle being agreed upon investment, looking at addressing fairness, and also financing modalities being well established so that they have inclusivity, transparency, and equity in mind.
Very well, thank you for that. And to President Malpass, any last remarks?
I was listening carefully to those two learned remarks, and I will to Tharman. And so my only thought is the funding is important at this point. The mechanism can be set up, but it's what we are dealing with in this pandemic is the recognition that quite a few countries were unprepared and didn't have the capacity to build even through a 2-year-long pandemic. So we want to work to avoid that situation in the future, and that's going to take sizable funding and a new mechanism, the fifth, in order to do that. Thanks.
Very well, thank you for that. And also to Senior Minister Shanmugaratnam.
Well, I think just to add to what's been said, after everything we've been through, we know that the requirements to avoid the next pandemic will have to involve more than incremental change to existing institutions, but neither is it necessary for us to have to work on a grand reconstruction of the whole system of multilateral cooperation. We have to strengthen the existing organizations, and we have to build new multilateral mechanisms to ensure complementarity between them and to enhance financing. That's our approach. It's not a whole reconstruction of multilateralism. There's no solution that does not involve a stronger WHO, reformed, empowered, and critically with more financial security, more predictability in its funding. There's no solution to strengthening global health security that does not involve a stronger WHO. There's no solution that does not involve making the most of the other global health organizations, which have very valuable capabilities. And there's no solution that does not involve a new multilateral mechanism, both to coordinate between finance and health ministers, as well as through the FIF, to respond with agility, to prioritize across the system, a fragmented system, to bring it together. So that's a significant strengthening of multilateralism when you put it together. It's not a grand reconstruction. You're not turning everything upside down. But we have to think in more than incremental terms. And as Minister Sitharaman pointed out last year in Rome, let's not let bureaucratic inertia and all the intramural squabbling get in our way. We've been through an immense crisis. It requires significant change. We can reform the system, and we must.
Very well. Thank you for that. In conclusion, that was a very powerful message. We cannot stay the same. We have to make changes, and the changes can be incremental. But at the end, we need to be able to come together because in conclusion, this COVID-19 pandemic and any other future pandemic requires for the global community to come together and also act together while making sure that nobody is left behind. And as the lesson learned throughout this pandemic COVID-19 is, I think it is not over until it is over for all. So, and this requires, as was mentioned again and again throughout this discussion, is a more just a more inclusive and sustainable approach. And with this, I'd like to wrap up this session. Thank you again for our distinguished panelists and speakers that have joined us in this session. From all over the world, we have the Treasury of the United States, Her Excellency Janet Yellen, and Minister of Finance of India, Her Excellency Nirmala Sitharaman, and President of the World Bank Group, Mr. David Malpass, and Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister of Social Policies of Singapore, co-chair of the G20 High-Level Independent, His Excellency Tharman Shanmugaratnam. And a big round of applause, perhaps, for our speakers from the floor in Jakarta. And as well, thank you again for all distinguished participants for joining us in this session. And we hope this session has been fruitful and also enlightening. And stay safe and healthy for everyone. I'm Kanya Sutisnawinata, and at this point, I'd like to close this session by inviting, for his closing remarks, the Central Bank Governor of Indonesia, Mr. Peri Warjio. Please welcome.
Well, the last two sessions is being remarkable. Distinguished Finance Minister, Central Bank Governors, panelists, speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Before we closing, let me, on behalf of both Minister of Finance and myself, would like to thank all of the speakers for the excellent presentation and deliberation. Indeed, the deliberation have provided us with a very valuable insights and step on ways to strengthen the global health architecture, how to better finance export efforts, and how to strengthen finance and health coordination. So what we learned today over the last two remarkable sessions. Let me start with the first session on the strengthening the global health resilience. Tackling the pandemic remains our top priority to ensure that we can recover together, recover stronger, and to ensure no one left behind. Therefore, it is critical to reach the target to vaccinate 70% of the world population by September 2022, and to continue to provide medical countermeasure and tools to end this pandemic, especially in emerging and developing economies. Given such ambition, we need to support international initiative to combat the pandemic, including by providing funding for research purposes, supporting the delivery of vaccine, procurement of tests, and medical equipment. However, a lot is yet to be done to overcome the pandemic. Thus, additional financial support is needed. In doing so, coordination among relevant stakeholders is key to ensure effective deployment of global support. Establishment of G20 Joint Finance and Health Task Force is aimed to continue improving coordination by promoting joint work by Minister of Finance and Health to achieve concrete outcome. On the second session on how mobilizing financing for global public goods. In order to strengthen resilience of global health system, mobilizing financing would be warranted. To fill the financing gap of pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, the PPR. In doing so, strengthening the spirit of multilateralism is crucial to achieve the investment on the scale needed to prevent the next pandemic. The G20 high-level independent panel studies has estimated the global PPR financing needs as much as 34.4 billion US dollar per year. Indeed, more financing needs, and also to cover the cost of the prolonged pandemic or future pandemic. The G20 Joint Finance and Health Task Force has been established at a strategic time to further explore ways to enhance finance and health collaboration to address these intertwined issues. The task force will review the major areas of concern in global pandemic PPR capacities and initiate a stock taking of existing public and private financing initiative for pandemic PPR. Furthermore, the task force will also discuss modalities to establish a financing facility for pandemic PPR. Another important element of mobilizing financings is the role of MDBs in providing financing instrument and coordinating the concerted efforts would help to achieve the financing objective, such as through grants, concessional loans, equity investment, guarantees or risk-sharing arrangement, contingent credit lines, and callable capital. Having said that, there is a challenge to mobilize financing in several countries, which is how to support low-income and vulnerable economies getting the financing needs. These countries may have limited market access due to high debt levels and sustainable issues, encounter lack of public financial management, which limit their ability to strengthen the domestic health system. In this case, vital role of new global financing mechanism to mobilize funding to support pandemic preparedness and responses, especially from the low and vulnerable countries, will be warranted. To conclude, strengthening the global health system with a robust and sustainable financing mechanism is an essential part of an exit strategy to recover together and recover stronger. To this end, Indonesia G20 presidency commits and call the multilaterals to take forward this agenda and deliver concrete outcome in 2022. Once again, I would like to thank you all of for the fruitful discussion, and we invite all of you who attending this meeting in person to once again tonight hospitality dinner at 7 p.m. See you there. Thank you.
Thank you to His Excellency Bapak Peri Warjio, the Governor of Bank Indonesia, for your closing remarks. We really appreciate your presence here with us, Bapak, despite your tight schedule at this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now covered the whole sessions of this seminar very well, I should say. A big hope is that we are able to capture much valuable information and knowledge from all of the speakers. And as mentioned earlier, that this seminar is co-organized by the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia and the Central Bank of Indonesia. Therefore, we would like to extend once again our appreciation to the Governor of Bank Indonesia, Bapak Peri Warjio, to the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, heads of delegations, speakers, and participants for making this seminar run successfully. Now we have arrived at the end of our program. I would like to end this program by saying once again, recover together, recover stronger. Thank you and see you in other occasions. Terima kasih, sampai jumpa lagi.